for this Subaru air conditioning system replacement video that due to some unforeseen circumstances and technical challenges that somehow I had managed to lose the original footage of the front bumper removal. And what you see here is actually footage that was recorded later on during the reinstallation process being played backwards just for your viewing pleasure. Now, the front bumper is actually super easy to remove. You pop off a series of pop clips on the top air dam front grille area, and then on the sides where the bumper wraps around into the wheel well, there are a series of clips there, and then some on the bottom where it connects to the lower air dam, which should be fairly obvious. So once those are removed, you just carefully peel the bumper away from the upper frame, and then as you pull the bumper away, that it should pop out of the brackets around the headlamps. They're just friction brackets. And then at that point, you can then disconnect the fog light wiring harnesses. With the bumper cover removed, we can then undo the radiator upper brackets by undoing the 12mm headed screws from each side and then lifting the bracket off of the securing post on the radiator. We want to remove the securing screws that hold the condenser to the rad support frame towards the front of the vehicle. Now there is one screw on each side of the upper portion of the condenser. Easiest way to locate them is look at where the headlights are and just undo one 10mm headed screw on each side of the condenser. Now our next step here is to undo the liquid line on the bottom front side of our condenser, and that's just held in with a single 10mm headed screw. Now here is the upper mounts that I had just undone those screws on, so our condenser moves freely. The bottom has no screws, they just sit on the lower subframe with some pegs. Now that lower liquid line from our condenser actually runs up to this hose, so it comes up through the subframe and then up into this flexible hose and then screws into our compressor. So again, just undo that screw to disconnect it. So with a tiny bit of shimmying back and forth and pushing the radiator back, the condenser will just barely clear the frame right here and over here, and you can just take that whole thing out. And that's our old condenser. Now, our air conditioning system basically had zero charge in the system, or it's been recharged and it doesn't hold the charge. And if you look very carefully here on the condenser, it looks like something hit it right here. So there's a very high chance that the leak in the system is actually coming from here, plus this whole area is kind of coated with a bit of oil or something. You buy the entire service kit, it comes with a new condenser, and on the side here is an integrated accumulator dryer. So the next step now is to undo this compressor liquid line, take that fitting off, and then install new O-rings and then transfer that onto the new condenser. Now before we do any work on our car, it is always best practice to disconnect the battery from the vehicle. So we'll just undo this negative cable. Now the compressor on this vehicle has failed because it's making a awful sort of rattling noise, and that's a known problem on this generation of Subaru. So we've ordered an updated design compressor, but before we can take that out, we got to make sure that we actually remove all the belts. So that can be achieved by taking off this belt protection cover by undoing this lone 10mm bolt and then popping off this little pop peg, I guess, underneath the alternator, at which point we can then loosen the alternator to remove the belts. Now that we've got the cover off on the belts, we need to loosen this front belt to get to the compressor belt, and we can achieve this by loosening the alternator mount bolts, which is located underneath this bracket here, as well as the tensioner bracket right here, and then loosening the tension adjustment bolt last. All are 12mm head bolts. So I want to apologize again, guys, for missing some of the footage here that shows how to remove the old belt from the compressor and crankshaft. Now, Subaru uses what they call a stretch belt, meaning that there's no actual adjuster to loosen to remove the old belt off. You actually have to use the belt installation tool to actually get it off without damaging the belt. In my case, I actually use a series of pry bars and then basically turning the crankshaft in a direction that will allow the belt to pop off. Not really the best way of doing it. Use the tool is the best approach. Alternatively, you can use a set of side cutters and just cut the old belt off and toss it, and then when time comes to reinstall a new one. I show how to use this installation tool later on in the video. with the belts removed from the alternator and the compressor, we now need to remove the compressor and its cradle from the engine bay. But before doing that, we're going to have to remove the electrical connector on top of the compressor, any other clips that we might have to flip the harness out, as well as that suction hose that I just pointed to. Now, the compressor has 4 long bolts that go sideways through it, 2 on the front and 2 on the rear. But they don't, you can loosen them, but you can't necessarily take them all out. I think only the very top front one can come out. Now, where my finger is, I'm actually pointing towards a bolt that's holding the compressor cradle to the engine block. So that also has to be undone. Once those are all unbolted or loosened, that the entire compressor and cradle assembly can be pulled up from the engine bay. So here's a close-up view of how I'm removing these bolts. Now you'll notice this front bolt here, even though it's unscrewed, can't fully come out because it makes contact with that front timing cover. Now conversely on the back, I'm using a quarter drive ratchet with a really long, narrow extension with a respective metric socket to undo that bolt. Again, like the front, you can only loosen them, but you can't actually pull the bolt out because it gets in the way of the intake charge pipe. So after undoing the hoses and the 4 bolts, 3 actually stay in place. So 1, 2, 3, but remember I loosened that cradle, and this whole compressor should just lift out of the engine bay. So this is what the compressor mounting area kind of looks like, guys, just to give you a better visual. So the compressor back bolt will hit this, that's why you can only loosen it. And same with the bottom, it'll hit this timing cover, and then that bottom bolt will actually hit right here. So the whole idea is that when you loosen those bolts and then you take that cradle out, that it just comes out as an assembly. Now, the old compressor and the new compressor may not necessarily have all the exact brackets and parts on it, so it's really important that anything like these type of brackets here get transferred over to the new compressor. What we've got here is our replacement compressor by Four Seasons and a 8-ounce bottle of PEG 100 premium synthetic compressor lubricant. Now this particular compressor, and you have to double check with the manufacturer, may come pre-shipped with the appropriate system oil, or in this case it comes with shipping oil inside the compressor, which we have to dump out and then refill with the appropriate amount of actual PEG 100. Now the other consideration you have to look into is that make sure that if you're going to order your compressor from a place like Rock Auto, that you pay very careful attention to the style of compressor that your vehicle needs. I actually made this mistake the other day, and this is actually a second compressor that showed up. Here is the stock compressor from the Subaru. Now in this 2012 Impreza STI, you have to look at this number right here. Right, it says DKV10R. There's another style called DKV10Z, and that was the mistake I made. The R has the outlets side by side on the back of the compressor, whereas the Z has an inlet and outlet on the front and back side of the compressor. We're going to unbag this, we're going to crack those plugs open, dump out that shipping oil, and then put in about 4 ounces of PEG 100 oil into it. This is our compressor after unwrapping it, and I was pleasantly surprised that the Four Seasons, I guess, compressor equipment company shipped out a very comprehensive set of instructions that has everything that you need to understand how to fill this compressor, as well as a QR code in the instructions that will link you to their website to sort of outline the amount of system oil you would need. Now, this compressor, when I bought it, said that it came with shipping oil that needs to be dumped out and I had to refill on my own. But much to my amazement, this compressor actually comes pre-charged with 3 ounces of oil in it. It even says here, pre-charged with 3 ounces of oil, and it's got a pink label, which means it's got PEG 100 from the factory. So that's awesome. Less work for us, and I guess I won't be needing very much of this at all then. We are replacing the condenser on this vehicle, so we do actually need to put about 1 ounce of that into the condenser regardless, so this is not all wasted. So let's go ahead and transfer this compressor onto that mounting bracket. You'll notice here that the screws are still intact on it, and the reason why is that they have to be in these positions before installing this lower bracket, otherwise you won't have enough clearance to actually tighten those all down. The other cool thing with the Four Seasons compressor, and any good quality compressor should have, is a set of new seal O-rings. We're gonna tuck our upper engine harness out of the way, right, and making sure that there's no bolts or anything that need to come out, and we can drop the compressor and that lower bracket assembly into the engine bay. and then begin lining up the holes such that we can start hand threading the compressor mounts and that lower bracket back into place. Loosely installed all the bolts, and it's important to emphasize loosely because I haven't tightened any of the 4 compressor bolts. They're just kind of hanging here. But it's really important to make sure that that 14mm bolt that holds that lower compressor mount wing is also screwed in. And in fact, that needs to be tightened down first and foremost before all the other bolts are torqued down, because otherwise you'll never be able to line that up properly onto the engine block. So just keep that in mind. Torque all these down, hand tight is all you need, and then we will move on to changing the O-rings out on the hoses and then installing them back on the compressor. Next step here after we've mounted our compressor is to swap out our condenser. And the reason why we want to do this is, number one, the condenser is on the front of your car's radiator and actually takes the most abuse from the road. So all these dings and damage is actually from the road debris that flies off the pavement and is the front line of defense. Your car's radiator actually sits behind this, which is why this is all damaged. Now, the other reason why we're replacing this is that on the Subarus, this side tank here is actually the accumulator dryer. So it has a desiccant material to help remove moisture out of the refrigeration system, which is important for proper operation. So you guys saw how I removed it by taking off the front bumper, but now what we're going to do is we're going to transfer our bolts, right? So this is the mounting bolts that hold it onto the frame. That's our lower liquid line retaining bolt, and then we actually have to transfer this liquid line from the top side. And then we're also going to drop in about 1 ounce of oil into the condenser as well, just so the system has sufficient lubrication. And these hoses here and these bracket bolts are all 10mm bolts. So we're just going to undo that bolt and then just carefully wiggle our hose. Give it a twisting motion back and forth to pop that O-ring out of our system. Now, that's what that looks like. The reason why the oil is green is that because a shop previous to me did the work, they inserted or injected some sort of UV dye. We won't care about this because we're putting all new parts in, but a real important thing is to make sure that this fitting is completely clean and that these O-rings are replaced with new ones that come with our AEC service kit. So here's my pick tool that I used to pull off that O-ring. Now, one thing you have to pay particular attention to is these end fittings here. There's a bunch of dirt and aluminum corrosion that has formed on the ends of these flanges, and it's super critical that they're clean, really clean, without getting any of the junk into that refrigerant line. Because if you have even a bit of debris, it's going to prevent this fitting from mating perfectly flush alongside the component that it's being mounted to. Now, here is one of the O-rings. Easiest way to match them up. We have our part number, which is an O-ring kit for our specific car. Just place it over the new rings and find the one that has the same diameter and thickness. And on the Subaru, at least, they are all different, but it's very obvious which ones they are. So right here is one of them. Okay, so I just cracked open my PEG 100 oil. Keep in mind that this oil absorbs moisture at a very rapid rate, so if you're gonna have this bottle of oil open, do everything as quick as possible. This fitting is super clean, and now I'm just going to use my fingers and just slide it over like that. Give it another coating of oil, and okay, so I'm just gonna slide this on to our new condenser. Of course, that went buttery smooth. So now I'm gonna take my little 10mm securing bolt and just hand tighten that to the condenser. And then as we drop this condenser into the vehicle and we have to attach this lower line, it'll be done exactly the same way, but you may recall that this lower line is still in the vehicle, so we'll have to kind of finagle it in that tight space. Okay. All right, so this is the lower liquid line. I've cleaned off our fitting and I've already pulled off the old O-ring, and there's a new one coated with plenty of oil. The next step now is to very carefully take our condenser and then pushing our radiator forward. It'll be a tight fit, just like it was when we removed it, to get this new one in. Like that. And then have it slide down ever so slightly into the engine bay. And then you're going to have a little bit of difficulty clearing the mounting blocks. So you just, again, just push a little bit harder to get each side in. Like that. Now, when you get the condenser down into the engine bay, you have your alignment pins that line up here and here. Insert your fitting into the condenser. And you'll notice I haven't bolted the condenser down yet because I need some wiggle room. So just move that back and forth, then reinstall our securing bolt to attach the hose. If it doesn't line up, you just have to twist it back and forth until you catch the thread in such a way that you can screw them in by hand. That's good. We got our condenser mounting bolts right here and here. So I put some anti-seize on this bolt just because you're screwing into aluminum, they're a bit rusty. We're going to carefully pass that through that grommet and then try to align that mount to our screw. And just make sure that you're not cross-threading it before you start tightening it, and then just repeat the same for the other side. We are done with the front end of the car. We can reattach our radiator brackets, just slide them on here, and then just reattach the two 12mm bolts on each side of these brackets. Because they're rusty and they're screwing to steel, again, recommend just putting a tiny bit of anti-seize on them prior to reinstallation. So with the condenser installed, the radiator secured, we're done with the whole front of the car. The next step now is to reattach this hose to the liquid side or the discharge side of our compressor, which is this blue port right here. Hot refrigerant gas under high pressure goes out into this line where it condenses into a liquid and then exits out the bottom. Now, I suspect that the small, slow leak that was coming off of this car ever since the engine was swapped is coming from this. If you look at this fitting and the O-ring, not only is the O-ring pretty hard, but more importantly is that it's flat and glossy. And that's a problem because an O-ring is supposed to have a bump to create a seal. And so the customer always said that they would refill the AC, they could never find the leak, and then they would have to get it recharged every year. And I'm telling you right now, the source of the leak is from here, which is very common, especially knowing that this engine came out and this was disconnected and never replaced. So just like all the other O-rings, we're going to remove it, clean off this fitting, lubricate it well, and before I attach to the compressor, I'm going to dump 1 ounce of oil down into this line because this condenser needs a bit of oil since this is a new condenser and it's dry. So let's go ahead and do that. Go. Okay guys, super unorthodox, imprecise, but you don't have to worry about oil being spot on because the compressor does have 3 ounces already, which is really all the system needs. But again, brand new condenser, super dry. We're going to put in about 1 ounce of oil. Okay, just 1 ounce, right? Not even. If you don't get exact, don't worry about it. It'll be just fine. Okay, so word of caution, guys, because we actually just had a little explosion in our garage. Nothing dangerous per se, but it will definitely catch a lot of folks off guard. When you undo the compressor shipping caps from the factory, this compressor is likely charged with an inert gas, probably nitrogen, to keep the internal oil dry. When you undo this, don't fully undo the screw the way I did, because this cap, about 5 seconds after I removed the screw, blew this right off and sent an oil mist everywhere. It's obviously discharged now, but just undo it and then slowly wiggle this off to relieve the gas in the compressor first. So here is our suction line. Again, look at the O-ring against the body of the fitting. It's flat, so it's not sealing well at all. So match that up, put a new one on. Install this hose first, and then this hose, and then pre-tighten. So suction first, and then the liquid line goes over. And then just hand tighten.
Okay, go.
Okay, then our final step here, at least on the top of this, is to just connect our clutch by plugging it into the terminal here, and then verifying the position of our bracket. I can already tell that when they shipped this, that they'd bent this bracket because it's supposed to be standing up, so we can just get a screwdriver and a pair of pliers to straighten that back out. Just mimic your old bracket. Okay, so that bracket was a bit bent, so bent it back in place, and of course, naturally, the wiring harness clips right onto it perfectly. Okay, so right along the firewall behind the intercooler on the top of the motor, you'll see this funky device, and that's called the TXV valve, or thermostatic expansion valve. This does the metering of the refrigerant to tell how much refrigerant should be flowing for the cooling needs of the vehicle. Now, on this car, it's undone. The dual line set is undone with a single 10mm bolt, and then within the TXV, there's two sort of subset of bolts that hold it to the evaporator coil, and I'll show you on the new part what that looks like. So here's the TXV, right? In order for you to maintain the warranty with your new compressor, that the system has to have a new condenser, a new TXV, and new O-rings, and so on. So this TXV, the line set bolts on here, there's that single 10mm bolt, and then once you pull the line set off, there'll be two sort of Allen head based bolts that pass through, that then couple to the inlet and outlet of the evaporator coil, which is why these two holes are there and these ones are sunken in. So let's undo that, pull it, change the O-rings out, and then put the new TXV in. Here we are. When we pulled this off, you'll notice that the liquid line, that thin line there, didn't come out, and that's by design. So they are separate, so we're just going to pull this out of the way, and then very carefully in this awkwardly tight spot, go and pull that liquid line out too, like so. And then we're gonna have to get an appropriate size Allen key wrench, get in there and undo it, and then this whole block piece should come out. Okay, so guys, I cannot overemphasize the importance of keeping everything super clean in this area. So these O-rings here, I made sure that I matched them all up with the original ones. I've lubricated them thoroughly, wiped off any dirt, and then lubricated them again. And now, so we have all new rings, but here's a service tip. Here's our TXV. You want to lubricate the inside bores of where the refrigerant lines are going to go through, and making sure there's no dirt instead of lubricating the rings, because you can actually spread more dirt because it's kind of dusty down there. Whereas if you put oil in here, it'll just slide on really easily. And you just tighten your Allen bolts and that 10mm securing bolt holding the line bracket just finger tight.
Like this. Here you go.
Okay. So with everything oiled up thoroughly, we're going to push this firmly onto our evaporator coil. And then we're going to get our bolts here, make sure they're clean, and then insert them through the recessed or the countersunk holes in the valve. Just carefully lift your line sets out of the way to get your tool where you have to get it. When you're tightening, try to spread the tightening sequence evenly across the two screws, just so that they seat properly onto those O-rings. Next, after finger tightening the TXV to the evaporator coil, we're going to now carefully install both line sets, making sure that they're seated firmly and squarely into those bores of our TXV valve. Okay, so making sure there's no gap on the flange here, and do the same for our suction side. Get that all in, and then apply a bit of anti-seize to this as well, just because it's got a bit of corrosion and it's aluminum. Just screw that in and just again finger tight. All right guys, so we got all the refrigerant components sort of installed, and we've made sure that the compressor has the right amount of oil, 3 ounces, and then about 1 ounce or so in the condenser, because we changed that out, and then we've also put in new O-rings and a new TXV. So now what we're doing is that we're actually pulling down our system using a vacuum pump and our sort of R134A approved gauge set. We've got our high side hooked up onto our liquid line, and then behind the intercooler by the TXV we've got our low set, and basically we're now just drawing out all the moisture in the system. Okay, so while this system is pumping down, we can do some other additional work like reinstalling belts and doing a bunch of other things here. Namely, while the system's pumping down, grab the front of the compressor, the clutch, and rotate it clockwise at least 10 times or more. The reason why we want to do this is that we want to actually get that bulk of that 3 ounces of oil out of the compressor and into the line set. It even tells you that in the instructions to do that. Now to reinstall our Subaru belt, we actually need this AC Delco part number 91031. It's actually made by a company called Gates, and they actually do a belt installation tool, and it's really silly how the belts are put onto this thing. The Subaru 2.5 liter engines use a stretch belt. Why they did this, I don't know. But there's this retainer right here that gets screwed on like this with a 12mm bolt that comes in the kit right here. And then we've got this little sliding ramp that goes on our crankshaft pulley and a retaining pin that goes into one of the holes on the crank pulley. And basically the idea is that you stretch the belt over the pulley and then turn the crankshaft using a 22mm ratchet and socket such that the belt slides over the grooves, which is what this thing covers on the crankshaft, so that it gets the belt on without damaging it. Now to set up this tool, you'll see that you've got this kind of funky curved piece of metal with these prongs and a hole in the bottom and a 12mm bolt. Now directly below the compressor here to the left, you'll see there's two holes here, a threaded one and an open hole. You're going to take this pin, you're going to hook that in, or actually I should say, you should put your belt in first over the pulley, like so. And then you're going to take your tool, this little hook part, goes in that bracket, and then the bolt passes through here, like so. And what this is going to do is, in fact, just hold the belt to prevent it from coming off of the pulley. And it pokes through that hole to prevent it from wobbling back and forth. So just attach that and just tighten it finger tight. It doesn't have to be crazy tight. But the belt has to fall underneath that finger, okay? So that's why you have to put the belt on first. So right here, see how the belt sits? It's gotta be like that to prevent the belt from ever coming out. So you just tighten it. Now, if you guys are just replacing the belt, make sure that you undo the radiator mounts right here. So one 12mm bolt that needs to have the rad with the bracket. Just take that off. The reason why is that I don't have any shallow 22mm sockets, which is needed to turn that crankshaft, so I need this little extra clearance. You don't have to do this if you have a smaller socket. I don't. Now, this tool here, okay, it's one of these funky tools that sits on a pulley, on the crank pulley, and essentially as you rotate forward, that it prevents the belt from catching the first row of grooves on your crank pulley. And then this little U-shaped bracket, it's got different lengths and different widths. The wider, longer end goes over the top of the tool, and then the lower one goes into one of the service holes on the crankshaft pulley. Now, if you look here at the crankshaft pulley, how you install this tool is, you'll see there's some service holes here. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 holes on your pulley, depending on your style of pulley. Okay, so we put this tool like this, right on the edge of the crankshaft. You see that? So it sits right on there, and then you're going to take your U-bolt or your U-channel thing, the wider end that goes into the tool, and the narrower, shorter end into the crank pulley, such that it locks it. Okay, and make sure it's positioned properly, like that, and it shouldn't move, okay? And it's got to be placed properly. And then we're going to take our ratchet now, making sure that the belt is proper on the AC compressor, that we're going to now rotate the crankshaft clockwise only, and that will eventually slip the belt back onto the crankshaft. Just very carefully and slowly help guide your belt on. And just like that. So you guys saw how easy it was and weird on getting that belt on that crankshaft. But once it got on, I removed that crankshaft tool because it's aligned properly. And I actually took off this upper bracket as well because it was actually putting pressure on the side of the belt, which is causing this belt to not track right. So when I removed it and I started cranking, notice that the belt now self-aligns, and it's nice and straight now on both the crankshaft and on the AC. Hey, next one is putting back the alternator and power steering belt. So this one's a lot easier, way more straightforward. You just line them all up on your pulleys, pull over your alternator, up. So I know how tight it needs to be. It's just gonna have a bit of deflection. And when that's completed, you're gonna go and tighten up this 12mm bolt and this 12mm bolt. Now while we're waiting for the system to pump down, we can also reattach the drive belt cover garnish, I guess. There's a little peg here that lines up this little hole, and then a 10mm bolt that passes through that to secure it. Push firmly down, and then insert a bolt. Now this bolt here is getting a bit rusty, so like all things, a tiny bit of anti-seize will prevent that from rusting further. Alright, so Subaru bumper on the STI, really easy. We basically just clip the sides underneath the headlights on, add the 4 clips on the top, make sure you reattach your fog light harnesses, and then reinstall the clips in the wheel well and on the underside of the bumper, and that's pretty much it. Now how I do this is I just kind of bring it up to the car. First and foremost, just kind of let it rest here. Get my vacuum pump out of the way. And then I'm going to grab my wiring harness, plug it in, like that. We'll do the same to the other side. It always helps if you've got a helper. And luckily the bumper's not very heavy. So now, what we do is we try to line it up to the front. But before pushing in the front, we have to line up all the clips here on the side. And this can be tricky at times, so you have to kind of work with it. So we want to get this lined up, and then one big pop, and that just goes in. And then the same thing here in the front. And then do the same for the opposite side. And then to initially hang the bumper, we're going to install the 4 clips in the top just so that it prevents it from falling off. And then we can do some fine tuning afterwards. 1 pop clip. 2. I won't bore you with all the details, but there are a bunch on the side wheel wells. Some of these on this car are broken, so we'll have to go to Subaru to order new ones. But you get the idea, and then there should be at least 2 or 3 on the bottom side of the car. So our system has been pumping down now for about 35 minutes. Our micron gauge says we're at 245 microns, and it's holding well. So we're gonna keep going for, about another half an hour, maybe even 45 minutes. We're in no rush to go anywhere, just to make sure that this whole system is pumped right down before charging. All right, so we've blanked off our vacuum pump from our manifold gauge set. It's been about 15, 20 minutes possibly, and that gauge hasn't moved a slight bit. Another 10 minutes have gone by. The vacuum pump is still trying to pump down the system where it can. It doesn't need to anymore. It's been well over an hour. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna close the valves on our manifold gauge, nice and firm, and then we're gonna shut off our pump. And we're going to transfer to our charging cylinder, making sure that our fittings are nice and tight. Make sure that's nice and snug. And then, wearing a set of safety glasses, we're going to slowly open up the vapor valve on the tank. Open that up. And then we're actually gonna loosen this yellow line just a hair. And the reason why I'm doing this, I'm just purging any air out of the system. Now, depending on your charging setup, you might not need to do this, but just a little bit. And tighten that back up. Now, the first step is, before we start our car, is that we're gonna add gas to our system. Both the liquid and the high side, just to equalize some of the pressure. Now shut off the liquid side, shut off the suction side. Okay, so now we're pressurized with 68 to 70 psi pressure. Now, making sure that your hoses are not gonna get caught in the belts, we're gonna now fire this car up, turn the AC on maximum. So I've got my psychrometer here, thermocouple measuring the air inlet and the engine bay go towards the blower motor, and then the outlet in the passenger vent closest to the evaporator. 86, 84. We've got a delta T of 1.5 Fahrenheit, and we got to get that down to at least a 20 to 25 Fahrenheit difference in delta T. So I'm going to get my buddy here to turn on the air conditioning compressor and get the system going. Fire it up. So now the compressor is running, and you can see the system is only at 5 psi. So we're going to start adding refrigerant until we can get this number to about 25 psi at the minimum at this point. Making sure that the high side valve is always closed. And you can see the compressor continues to run, and it's nice and smooth. So that's what we want. The old compressor was really rattly and noisy. Okay, so we're about 25 psi now, and it's falling, so we're going to let that stabilize for a little bit. And you can already see that the delta T is now 13.5 degrees and dropping. So we're going to let this run for at least 10 minutes for the system to stabilize pressures. So we've added a little bit more gas during the time we were waiting for the system to stabilize. Subaru specs call for a low side of 18 to 28 psi and about 213 to 228 on the high side when ambient temperatures are between 85 and 95 Fahrenheit at 1500 RPM with the air conditioning system set to recirc, windows all open. So we've been doing this and running it. My low side here is coming in at around, I would say, 22 psi, and the high side is just a hair over 200. I think that's 205. So we're almost spot on as far as the Subaru manifold set spec calls for. And then we're measuring our ambient intake temperature right here, which is showing us an intake temperature of at least 99 degrees now, of the engine being as hot as it is. And then T1 is actually the temperature probe that's coming out of our air vent. So yeah, you can see there's a delta T difference of almost 46 Fahrenheit. It's nice and cold, it feels nice and dry, which is what air conditioning should feel like. Again, system pressures, you know, this will vary, right, depending on when the condenser fan comes on, but our low side pressure is almost spot on to where it needs to be. This will change with heat loading. Alright, so we're taking the Subaru for a cruise to test out the AC and to take a break because it is so freaking hot out. Went and got ourselves a nice cold beverage, and our AC system is freezing cold. In fact, I'm actually really cold, and it's like 33 degrees outside right now, Celsius. But as you guys can see, replacing the entire AC system on a Subaru is very straightforward and can be done with some basic tools and a nice, cheap, inexpensive order from Rock Auto. And I'll provide all the links in the video description below. If you guys like this video, give me a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel, and thank you for watching.